Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Europeans in North America, specifically Colonial North America, Section 2. And we're going to continue where we left off in Section 1 and try to finish up this today and really combining the Section 2 and Section 3 part of your textbook. And your textbook goes in a little more detail about Colonial North America, but as I mentioned in Section 1, we're going to continue talking about that more and more in American history and various other resources, so I don't need to spend too much time there. Now, one of the next things that we want to talk about where we kind of left off and things that are affecting the colonists following the French and Indian War, okay, or kind of building up to the French and Indian War, and then getting into the Revolutionary War, and we'll kind of talk about all that today. The British passed what is known as the Writ of Assistance, okay, and the Writ of Assistance basically said that the British troops could search the colonists without a warrant, and this is in 1761, so this is 15 years before the Declaration of Independence is signed and before any kind of documents are being created to govern a country, so to speak. The colonies up until this point had not really necessarily been joined. Really about 1754 when the French and Indian War starts, there's the Albany Plan of Union that's created at the Albany Conference where they're trying to decide whether or not they should join like forces and they should form like one entity that's kind of governing the colony so that they can fight against the French and so on, but we'll talk more about that. During this time, this is kind of the way the map looks in regards around this time period for the U.S., well, not the U.S. at that point, but America. And the blue you'll notice is a lot of the French-controlled areas, and that extends all the way up into Canada, all the way down into Louisiana, and that's important because all the way up until 1812, we're going to pretty much be dealing with the British, the French, all of these groups the colonies are dealing with all the way through those areas. And especially right in this area, there's a lot of hostility because there's a lot of farmers that are in England that they want this land, as well as they want to get over here and get access to the Mississippi River running down past through Tennessee, up and through Illinois, etc. Okay. Then over here on the backside, still got a lot of Spanish-controlled area. Spain still controlling Florida, and we'll get more into that anyway. So getting back on where we kind of left off in Section 1 with the events that led to the Revolution, first of all was the French and Indian War, and it was pretty much the French people who were settled versus the British Army. And the problem with this war was colonists didn't really understand, I guess, the war in some ways. They knew that they wanted the land, but they weren't necessarily willing to start an entire war with France. And so it was kind of a little bit British influenced. On top of that, on the other side of the pond, back in England, there was a lot of people who didn't understand why Britain was making such a big deal over fighting for one of its colonies. And you're going to see kind of the same idea with the Revolutionary War of getting involved so heavily in the colonies. However, the French and the British are actually fighting back in England as well. So it's not just a isolated war to America. Now, the part that takes place in Europe we know is the 7 Years' War, but while the 7 Years' War is going on, the French and Indian War is going on in North America. So it's called the French and Indian War specifically because the French and the Indians were working together, and that's specific groups of Native Americans. The Iroquois Indians actually, they stayed out of this war, and they were one of the biggest tribes there in the Northeast. That if we go back to our map here, the Iroquois are up here in the New York area. They don't get involved, even though a lot of the fighting is kind of going on right here around the Ohio River Valley. The Iroquois Indians stayed out of it. Parliament decided to tax the colonists following the war to raise money, and this is going to be kind of what sparks a lot of the hostility from the colonists towards Britain, because number one, they're kind of drafted into the military, and I mean, yes, they're fighting for their country in some ways, but they're fighting for England. They're not fighting for the colonies. And England, who has kind of exerted control over the last 100 years, is now going to put this new tax in place. And you've already got people that we talked about before that feel like they don't have a voice in Parliament or in what we call England's governing group, if you want to call it that. They don't have a voice there. Okay, so it's just like our House of Representatives and our Senate, where we as Americans vote those representatives, and they represent us, maybe not necessarily our individual voice, but us as a whole. And we have somewhat of a voice towards what goes on in America. They had no voice, they had no representative, they had nobody speaking up for them. So when Parliament passes this tax, the colonists are obviously going to be very upset. Now, because of the French and Indian War, colonists kind of developed a little bit more of a sense of independence. I talked about that Albany Plan of Union, and it's kind of one of the first times that we see the colonists thinking of themselves as an independent group. And you're going to see the colonists kind of that mindset over the course of the next 20 years really grow and expand into what becomes the Revolutionary War. Now, after the French and Indian War, there, like I said, there was a lot of hostility over the taxes that the British are putting in place. You had the sugar tax, you had the Stamp Act, which really upset people because it taxed any type of paper product that you were using. Pretty much, if it had to be printed, you had to put a stamp on it, and it had to be a stamp that you paid for through the British. And the reason that's important is the Stamp Act ended up being more of a direct tax on the actual people, so it affected regular people versus the Sugar Act was kind of more corporations, if you want to call them that, during that time. But then after they start to kind of resist some of that, you get the Quartering Act. And the Quartering Act was part of the coercive acts, and you guys are taking some of those definitions so we can kind of skip a few of those things and let you get those on your own. But the coercive acts were put in place as a result of the Boston Tea Party, and basically the colonists tried to revolt against the British through their tea in the Boston Harbor, and then essentially, in order to kind of quell that, they put in place the coercive acts, and part of that was the Quartering Act, okay, where colonists were forced to house the British troops. All right, so whether you wanted to or not, you were forced to allow them to stay there and provide food, etc. Now, stepping back for a second, okay, and looking at the Boston Massacre, first of all, colonists began throwing snowballs at British troops. It was potential that it was rocks, etc., but they were advocating for get my thoughts here. They were advocating for like themselves against the fact that there was the Quartering Act, that you had these troops that were in place. Okay, but this, and when I say stepping back, what I mean here is this is kind of a buildup from the end of 1763 when the war ends with the French and Indian War. When you get to 1770, this is kind of that time period where it's been 7 years of hostility. It isn't like this just all culminate all at once. There's been a lot of advocating, and you're starting to see people are not happy with the way they're being taxed, and the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, all this stuff. Then you get the Quartering Act put in place. Then you're going to get the Boston Massacre, okay? And the Quartering Act is kind of a part of those coercive acts, as I mentioned, even though it's going to be put into place earlier. The coercive acts come here after this Boston Massacre, and we'll talk more about that with the Boston Tea Party. The Quartering Act is going to kind of refall into place where they're going to occupy the city. And so essentially what happens here is the colonists are throwing snowballs, British troops kill 5 colonists because they think they've been hit by, if they're being attacked, gun goes off, whatever happens. And so in 1770, you get a lot of upset people. Now, fast forward 3 years later, you get Bostonians who are not only upset about the Boston Massacre, but are also upset about the taxes that are being put in place, and they dump the tea in the harbor, which is going to only cause the Quartering Act and those coercive acts to be more harshly enforced. Okay. Now, I do want to take 1 second, and I don't have the slide for it, but I know that you guys are taking the definition for it. The coercive acts of 1774, known as the Intolerable Acts in the American colonies, were a series of 4 laws passed by the British Parliament to punish the colony of Massachusetts Bay for the Boston Tea Party. Okay, so this is kind of that period right now is kind of where those coercive acts come in. All right, now there was another Quartering Act put into place. Okay, so that's the Quartering Act. You had the first one in 1665. Then you had the one that I was really more talking of when we were talking earlier about the coercive acts. Basically, they put in all of these things to force Boston to do what they want. And the reality of it is, it goes back to what we've been talking about, that they have no real voice in Parliament that's advocating for them against all of this violence or all of these acts, I should say, not violence, all these acts and taxes, etc. Now, what that's going to lead to is you're going to have a group of men from each colony meet at what we call the First Continental Congress. Okay, and essentially these delegates, I believe it's 55 of them. These 55 delegates, they decide they're going to boycott British goods. Okay, that they're not going to support any type of import or product from Great Britain. Now, the important thing about that is that's going to cause Britain to try to enforce their laws more harshly. Because of this, the colonists start building up weapons, start building up ammunition, building up resources, and in 1775, the British, bringing in forces into Boston to basically try to enforce the law, attack at Lexington and Concord, two munitions depots there in Boston. And that kind of kicks off the war. That's the first battles of the Revolutionary War. More importantly, guys, you're going to see a lot of anger out of the colonies, not only over the Boston Massacre, but now the British Army is attacking its own people and bringing in the military to basically say that you're going to do what we say or else. And in at least world history for sure, or else does not normally work out so well. But so we can finish this up, I'm going to speed up. One of the last things that I want to mention today is Common Sense. Okay, and Common Sense was an article written by Thomas Paine to convince the colonies to break away from England in 1776. And this kind of precedes that Declaration of Independence that's going to be printed out and going to be brought, or not printed out, I should say, but written and brought out to the people to say, hey, we are declaring ourselves independent from England. And Common Sense basically said all of these things about how it made sense that a monarch should act, how it made sense how a leader should act, how there should be certain rights and things that a human being naturally has. And all of these things made common sense that makes sense to you. Now, Thomas Paine's pamphlet goes all around the colonies, and it's going to lead to kind of more support from the rest of the colonies. Because at first, guys, the Revolutionary War was not supported by the colonies. I mean, it was, obviously Massachusetts and some of those northern colonies maybe, but like North Carolina, South Carolina, some of those colonies weren't initially on board, like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, etc. Now, one of the things that did really lead to a lot of this just kind of anger towards the British is what we call salutary neglect. And we talked about the Navigation Acts in Section 1. England begins trying to enforce these regulations after they did not enforce the regulations when they were first instituted. So the Navigation Acts were put in place, some of these taxes were put in place. Until the 1760s, England never really tried to enforce those laws. Now they're trying to, same thing I talked about before, they're trying to put their thumb down on them and really make it hard on them to, do what they want to do. They've taken away the independence of their colonies, made them royal colonies, given them royal governors who are in control. So now, all of a sudden, these people are like, why now do I have to have all this control from England? Like, we were fine basically ruling ourselves. And that's what salutary neglect is they neglected the colonies for such a long period of time. Whenever they tried to step in and enforce the laws, the colonies weren't happy. Now, as far as the colonies go, the Quakers founded Pennsylvania, the Catholics founded Maryland, Roger Williams founded Rhode Island after being kicked out of Massachusetts because he said that he believed in separation of church and state. That's an important element there of our American history because that's going to be obviously what our government's based on. And then James Oglethorpe founded Georgia. Okay, so those are just a few kind of extra things to kind of pick up there towards the end of things we missed at the beginning that I wanted to kind of throw there on the back end. But just so you have a couple founders, et cetera, about the colonies. Now, one last thing I want to make mention about, because I don't want to skip through this. The Quakers are going to be an important element as we go through some of these court cases and Supreme Court cases and various laws, because the Quakers were a very peaceful group and they did not believe in violence, as well as they were very supportive of various religions, which is going to help in religious freedom, And you're going to kind of see that with all the groups that we have here that I have listed, they're going to be very influential to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution because of their natural instinct to set up government. Okay, so the way they set up their government, popular sovereignty, trying to set it up where all people had a choice and a lot of freedoms there. And so that's going to kind of be a heavy influence. So sorry I ran over a little bit. I know it's a little bit of a longer lecture, but like I said, there's a lot there we're trying to cover in a very short amount of time. And that did cover section 2 and section 3 of your textbook. All right, make sure you guys are finishing up your vocabulary for this chapter and make sure you're keeping up with your notes and your bell ringers each day. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.